Part 2.2, Salvation expressed by the relations of head and body, bride and bridegroom, according to Karol Wojtyła. After Cardinal Wojtyła finishes expounding his understanding of salvation based on the council text Gaudium et Spes, number 10, he goes on to express it in terms of head and body, then in terms of bride and bridegroom, page 91. Indeed, the entire 11th chapter is entitled, The Bridegroom is with you, pages 91 to 100. He makes use of this biblical and traditionally rich graphic means of presentation in the context of the history of salvation in order to preach a meditation on the death and resurrection of Christ and on Pentecost, which he then associates with reflections on the sacraments of baptism, Eucharist, and matrimony. We will concentrate on the main point of the meditation, on the relationship of the bridegroom and bride. In the center of his remarks stands the bridal relationship of Christ to his church, the church as body and bride of Christ. Moreover, quote, Christ is the head of the church, which is his body. Christ is the bridegroom of the church, which is his bride, end quote. This traditional statement is theologically elaborated, then applied to salvation. Salvation is like a, quote, marriage bond, which Christ has effected with the church by his own death and resurrection. Consequently, the, quote, birth of the church at the moment of the redemptive death of Christ was simultaneous with, quote, her marriage to the divine bridegroom. Or, expressed differently, quote, the death of Jesus Christ on the cross is an act of supreme love, amor Dei usque ad contemptum sui, i.e., the love of God carried as far as contempt of self. It is in character with the love both of the Redeemer and of the bridegroom, page 94. The relation between the sacrifice of redemption and the spiritual nuptials is still more precisely defined. Quote, so the love of Christ the bridegroom stems directly from the cross and the sacrifice. The Redeemer is the bridegroom by virtue of being the Redeemer. He is able to bring his gift to the church precisely because he has already given himself in the sacrifice of his blood. End quote. Therefore, there is no essential difference between the love of the Redeemer and the love of the bridegroom. Rather, they are correlative and essentially identical. Christ as Redeemer is also the bridegroom. All of the above concerns, as such, the relationship of Christ, Redeemer and bridegroom, to his redeemed bride, the church. So far, the texts are completely in line with Scripture and tradition. The bridal relationship of Christ to the church is indeed a singular relationship, yet one notices a constant attempt to include all men in this intimate sphere. Thus, Cardinal Wojtyła, without the necessary theological distinctions, announces to the church and to every man by the same token, i.e., to all mankind, quote, behold, the bridegroom is with you. And the church heard it and understood, quote, Christ is with us, the bridegroom is with us, he is with the church, he is with every man, woman, and child, he is with the entire human family, end quote. Or, quote, really there does seem to be a need to recall and repeat to the men of our day, the bridegroom is with you. His love for you is so great that he gave himself fully and irrevocably. Jesus wished us to inherit from him nothing less than the love of every single human being, end quote. Or, more to the point, in the first sentence of the following chapter, quote, as I said at the end of the last meditation, The love of Christ who loved the church and sacrificed himself for her, Ephesians 5:25, Galatians 2:20, the love of the bridegroom goes out to every human being, end quote. Our question runs, does the mystical image of the bridal relationship of Christ to his bride, the church, equally hold true for the relationship of Christ to every man and to all of humanity? If that be the case, then the remarks on the relationship of bride and bridegroom are a metaphorical expression of the thesis of universal salvation. Let us take a closer look at the last part of the above quoted text. The sentence summarizes the foregoing remarks and brings them to a head. In that way, the hidden meaning comes to light. It is clearly said that it is the love of Christ, i.e., of the bridegroom to his church, which, quote, goes out to every man. Consequently, the same bridal relationship which exists between Christ and his church also exists between Christ and all of humanity. This conclusion is the only logical consequence of the Cardinal's thesis, namely that the redemptive death of Christ was not only the moment of the birth for the church, but also the moment of supernatural birth for each and every man, quote, regardless of whether he knows it or not, whether he accepts it or not, end quote. This interpretation is confirmed by numerous utterances of the Cardinal on the subject of Christ's relationship to every man. This relationship is described, for instance, as, quote, an indissoluble bond with the, quote, living God, which through the death and resurrection of Jesus, quote, is with every man and all of humanity, end quote. The relationship of Christ to, quote, every human being is also portrayed as a, quote, complete definitive surrender and a, quote, union with every man. We may draw at least a tentative conclusion. Since Cardinal Wojtyła applies the image of the love of Christ, the love of a bridegroom for his bride, the church, to the relationship of Christ to all of humanity, the image becomes the metaphorical expression of the thesis of universal salvation. Although our interpretation seems obvious, nevertheless, we ask, can the Cardinal's remarks not also be understood differently, namely, in the sense of Holy Scripture and tradition?